Well, welcome back to Tip of the Spear with your Missoula County Commissioners. Today, we're joined by Dan Clark. He's the director of Montana State University's Local Government Center. And I'm Commissioner Juanita Vero with Commissioner Josh Slotnick, and Commissioner Dave Strohmeyer is in Seattle at a
conference on FQHCs, on
federally qualified health centers. Yeah. So we're so excited to have you back with us, Dan. And thanks for making the trek over from Bozeman.
Yeah, it's good to be back. Thanks.
So Dan, I understand while you're here, as you do typically when you go to places, you do trainings on how local governments work, and you are going to work with some of the folks who serve on our many boards. Some of them are elected, some of them are appointed. Some of the folks who are on these boards help manage some chunks of money that have been gathered through taxes. Given that we have you here, I wanted to see if I could get some of your 2 cents on how local government is funded and the property tax system, and what do you think of it? How do you think it works, and what could be changed?
Those are some big questions.
Yeah, we have time. We can chat.
Thanks. Yeah, Montana, as you know, is funded primarily through, it's like a 3-legged stool is what typically is funding local governments around the country. Montana's operating with a 2-legged stool, at least the state of Montana operates that way. And so we have property tax and income tax. There's other taxes that go along in that. Our primary chunk of money comes from those 2 sources, since we don't have a sales tax statewide.
And the property tax and income tax seem, at least from my perspective, pretty different in that we don't mess with income tax at all at the local level.
So majority of what's funding local government is going to be that property tax. So yeah, so I'll start with this concept, and this been getting some traction with this thought process for a while. But one of the reasons and rationales of creating government is so that we can do things collectively that we can't do individually. So in communities, we kind of align ourselves around this concept that there are certain things that make sense for us to do as a group. So public safety, fire, police, transportation, building roads, building schools, public education, water, sewer, public health issues.
Elections,
which then goes to the point that when we come together and we realize there are certain needs that we have collectively, that let's pool our resources together to fund these public assets, to provide these essential services. And let's elect people to represent our interests, to make decisions about how they manage those assets and how they invest those public dollars to provide those essential services. So there's this interesting relationship that we have amongst the public and the elected representatives, and the stewardship that they have to reflect the interests and needs of the public as they manage those public assets and resources. So we have these taxes, which is part of that social contract, where we say to ourselves, look, we need to make these economic investments collectively for the good of the whole. So we all pay into our school systems to educate our youth. We benefited, at least I did, the product of the public education, which some people might say that didn't go well for you, Dan. But we all benefit from public education. And so although I don't have children in K-12 right now, I still pay a tremendous amount of my tax dollars goes towards supporting that school system to educate the next generation. As someone paid for me and I pay for my children, then I'll pay for the next generation of children. So it's kind of that social contract that we've all agreed to by virtue of living in your county, living in your city, living in the United States. It's this social contract that we're going to help fund certain things that are of importance to society. So that's the social contract aspect of it. And so then how we get down into funding that. So there's certain sources of revenue that comes to local governments. So one of which is property tax. And that's where you're taxed based on value of your home or your property. And there's a different tax rates for different classifications of property, and you pay into that pool through property tax. Another way in which government is funded or operates, or revenue source, would be fees. There's certain fees that we charge for services. So say your solid waste collection.
We have some sewer and water districts, but they're all RSIDs. So in a sense, it's a fee.
Yeah. And so you're paying for fees and assessments. So fees would be for a service that you're being provided. So if you have your garbage being collected, there's going to be a refuse district that pays for the infrastructure to collect garbage and dispose of it. And that fee is then based on operation of the system, maintenance, depreciation, like garbage trucks are going to depreciate. We need to replace those at some point, and then debt service. And that's what goes into making the fee. There's not a profit to that. There's just, what does it cost to operate this system?
Yeah.
And then we have enterprise funds, which run the same way. These assessments, like an SID or RSID, rural special improvement district, or a special improvement district. It's an assessment based on something other than your taxable value of your property.
Sure.
So it might be based on the total frontage of your property for maybe a road maintenance. You own a quarter mile of road front, and so you're going to pay based on footage of that,
Yeah.
and it goes into a fund, and that helps support. And you're paying for more of an equitable way of paying for it. If I have a very small property, I'm going to pay a very small amount versus a very large property. So that's your assessment. And then you have other sources of revenue that comes into the fund, local government, particularly counties. You'd have a state disbursement. So you have some money comes back to the county. It's collected by the county and sent to Helena, where they then distribute that money to the state. And then they distribute that money back to the counties based on a formula. And we call that the entitlement share, which is a terrible name.
Yeah, and it feels like, at least from our perspective, that on the entitlement share, I'm thinking of what happens over at the clerk and recorder's office when people are dealing with vehicle titles. That we're collecting money, but we're doing work. We have people employed there. We have a space to maintain. The money that comes back isn't just like the cream on the milk. It has to cover the costs of us hiring people to work in that space and manage the computers and manage all the
paper and
paperwork printers and deal with the people. So I just want to be clear for anybody listening. It isn't money coming back like, cool, we got some free money. We actually have to pay people to do the work of collecting the money, and it's not just cashing the checks, it's managing the whole title program.
Oh yeah, so before, in the 90s, 80s, 90s, there was a whole hodgepodge way of which money was being collected. Some was going straight to the state that had a distribution back to the cities and counties. Some was being collected on the local level, being sent to Helena, which then money was then redistributed back. There was a lot of moving parts, and it wasn't very efficient. And so through the late 90s, there was a lot of work being done by the legislature to figure out how to streamline that process, to make it more efficient, so we're not getting bigger and bigger in government just to process stuff. Through that effort came out of the 2001 legislative session, which is what they call the Big Bill, which is a revamp of these local assessments and fees and things that were being collected locally, and some taxes, vehicle taxes, and some of those things. And so there's a different way in which they're collecting and going about the collection of that and distribution of it. And so it's based on a formula now. And so a lot of the urban, what we'll say the larger cities and counties of the state, we're going to take a bit of a cut on that. More of it would be distributed evenly and fairly across the state, based on population, based on a very complicated formula. And that's where we have the entitlement share. And it's just a terrible name because it sounds like it's an entitlement,
Like
which is really not. This is
So what would be a better, more descriptive title?
We've been struggling with that. How do we rebrand that? And the challenge is that was the culmination of a lot of legislative effort over many sessions of legislators that had been in Helena in that role for a long time. And it took them a long time to start really figuring out the complexity of our tax system and how it functions, how it works. And so when you start messing with a very complicated, think of a ball of string with lots of little bits coming out of it, and you pull on one, it's going to have an effect of the overall ball. And that's really what they were trying to figure out, is how do we rethink and reimagine this tax process and this collection and redistribution of resources. And came out of that was the Big Bill in 2001. And then shortly thereafter, the term limits kicked in, and there's just not the longevity anymore of these legislators that can just through experience figure out how this system works. And it can be argued by some, you'll hear that they'll say that that was probably the last time we had any significant statewide impactful legislation that it came out of the legislative process on the state level. And it's kind of morphed into kind of quick, easy bills and things that don't have that same level of...
We see bill language taken from bills in other states.
We're from an organization that has prefabbed the language and will just stamp it and throw it through the system. We need a Montana solution for these Montana challenges, which we have a unique funding system, and we need a unique solution to it.
Right. So when folks say, you hear this, that we have a broken system or our taxing system isn't matching. I mean, the taxing system that we operate in was appropriate for the economy of the 1950s, but our economy is different now.
Yeah.
And so what needs to happen to make them align so that our taxing system matches the current economy of...
And can I ask an add-on to that?
Yeah.
It seems like the property tax system as the foundation for local government made some kind of sense when we had a handful of very large employers that paid a lot of property tax. But those 4 mills that ran Missoula are gone now. And it feels like that property tax burden has instead been shifted to residential homeowners. But I'm just taking a guess at that.
Well, yeah, I think we'll see that as our economy has shifted over the last 30 years. How the revenue is generated has been shifting. And the cost of doing business continues to go up. We're in this high inflation right now, and it costs money to provide these essential services. And how we choose to generate those funds through our tax policy probably is not in line with where we are in our current modern economy. So there has been some shifting, and this is the challenge that we face, the need for us to have a really strong, hard look at and a deep look at how we are funding government in the state of Montana and how is it impacting our local governments. What's happened is right now you can't raise your taxes more than 1/2 of the 3-year average of inflation. That's baked into the system. So the only time your revenue goes up as a county to provide these services, that you have that locked in 1/2 of rate of inflation averaged over 3 years. So if you had no new construction, nothing new added to your tax rolls.
If we get no new construction and if real estate doesn't go up in value or assessed value, we're in a situation where we're using 2019 money to buy 2022 tires for the sheriff's trucks.
Yeah. We did a quick on the back of the napkin calculation, and we looked at the inflation rate over the last 20 years since the big bill went in. If you just add up those raw numbers of annual inflation, it went up almost just shy of 50%, about 47%. And then if you add up the amount that you can add to your mills, that inflationary increase, and it's about 24%. So each year that goes by, you're getting further and further behind in local government. And the needs in government are on the local level. You folks are the ones that are delivering the local services. You're making sure that people are healthy and complying with state regulations and local regulations.
So I'm sorry, this formula then was baked into the big bill. So what was the formula before 2001?
Well, before it was locked in with I-105 back in the late 80s when we did an initiative statewide that froze property taxes. And so it froze property taxes.
So property taxes never went up?
Yeah, so that's where they just said that's it from I-105, and then the legislature over time was able to create laws that would allow this rate of inflation, recognizing that we need some growth in your ability to fund government.
So this was just how they threaded the needle to do this half the rate of inflation over a 3-year period. They were just trying to accommodate.
Feels like there's a baked-in problem here in that the folks who are deciding how taxes can be raised or not raised are not the people who are spending the money. So if you're in the state legislature, I imagine you hear loud and clear from your constituents that your property taxes are too darn high. So the person hearing that could assuage the concerns of the person who's angry by passing laws like the big bill in 2001. Or a whole handful of other things that they've done to make sure that those darn property taxes won't go up. Because I'm sick of hearing about it as a state legislator. But the state legislator isn't the person who's responsible for the sheriff's budget or for public works' budget or for the planning department's budget. So I feel like that disconnect has tilted policy away from let's figure out how we can deliver services and towards let's cut taxes. And cutting taxes is fine if you didn't care about delivering services. But as you described when you were talking about the social contract, this is the money, this is the fuel that's used to honor that contract. And if you turn the tap off on the fuel, the ability to honor that contract is greatly compromised. I feel like we're in a really, really tough spot, especially in urban counties where the demand for services is higher. And I also see a baked-in issue in that we have two really different sets of counties, the big ones and the small ones, with very, very different issues. And the one tax solution that may work in the majority of counties doesn't work at all in the minority of counties. And the majority of legislators are from the majority of counties. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think these are some of the challenges that we're facing. As I travel around the country and I work with my colleagues that do work like I do, centers that are based in universities, and they talk about the relationships in their states between the legislative body, the legislature, and their local governments. It's varied in that relationship, and some that they really clearly see that as a partnership. The state government and local governments, they see themselves in a partnership, that we're working together to serve all of the people of our state, and we're trying to solve statewide issues that are going to have impact on the local level and vice versa. What are the local needs that you have, and how do we take the ability that we have on the statewide perspective and try to help that?
Add politics to that mix.
Well, yeah. So it's complicated.
And other revenue streams, because these places that you're talking about
they have more options for looking at
the partnership you're talking about. I mean, are states that have like a sales tax, or how could we make a unique partnership with our legislature and our local governments in Montana that is a Montana partnership?
Yeah, and I think trying to bridge the divide, and it seems to me that there is a bit of a tension between state government and local government. I've been trying to figure that out for 15 years. What's driving that tension? And the only thing I can think of is we're still a retail politics state. Legislators are still going out knocking on doors and they're talking to people. What are the issues? And
I'm sorry, what was the phrase you used again?
Retail
politics.
Okay.
We're knocking on doors, talking to
Yeah.
people, shaking. It's very much that way in Montana. And they'll ask them, what are the challenges that you're facing? What is it that I can do for you if I go to Helena on your behalf? And right now, I don't think the population of Montana really gets the nuance between state and local government. They're just frustrated and they brand it all or paint it all with one brush. And so I think what legislators are probably hearing a lot as they're doing their knocking on doors and talking to citizens or property taxes and some of the things that are going on locally. We might have a board that's kind of upside down, that it's not doing well, like a water sewer district or whatever. And that's all they hear is that. And so they have this image in their mind that things are just falling apart on the local level, which they're not. I think we find that as a rarity, that things are really upside down on the local level. There's a level of frustration out there.
So recently I read an editorial, and this was by the proponents for CI 121, which is the proposal that would basically freeze property taxes. And the author of the editorial was a legislator. And he said, we need to freeze property taxes because the state is flush with money. They have a bazillion-dollar surplus. They don't need any money. And I'm reading that thinking, that's not the point. It has nothing to do with it. And I'm not sure where that was. That willful ignorance? Was it deception? I'm not sure why he wrote this entire editorial about property taxes needed to be frozen because the state was flush. No mention of local government. And then that's actually where property taxes go. Any thoughts on that?
There's a bit of a disconnect. And this is the challenge that comes from the term limits, that there's just not enough time in the seat to really understand what's going on and how the state is funded. What does the kitty look like that the state has access to? And where do those funds come from? And how do they invest those funds to provide the essential services statewide? Likewise, how is local government funded? What's that partnership? What's that relationship? And how do we manage that relationship in an effective way so that the citizens are being cared for and there's sufficient resources, whether that service is being delivered on a state level or on a local level, that the citizen is cared for. And that's where I think there's this disconnect and there's this misunderstanding of how local government operates. So here's the other thing to think about is we have in the Montana Code annotated in Title 15, Chapter 10, right? We're all familiar in local government. Mm-hmm. We live by that statute. And you just rattle it off all the time. Mm-hmm. And so that means we talked earlier about you're limited to raising your taxes based on 1/2 of the rate of inflation averaged over 3 years. The only thing that's increasing is if you add more property.
Or the property goes up.
Or the property value goes up. But what's happening there is as that goes up, then your number of mills goes down. Now, because 1510-420 exists, and there's a need that you identify or the citizens identify in their community, we want this particular service. And as a local government say, we would love to provide that service. Mm-hmm. We're best suited for it. We have the infrastructure to do it. We just don't have the money to do it because of these constraints, financial constraints we have. However, if you would like this service to be provided, we can put on the ballot and have a majority of the people in our jurisdiction vote on whether they want to increase their property taxes to fund that. A majority of the taxes, property taxes, let's be honest, is going into public education.
Yeah.
Right? Less of that property tax goes to you.
It's kids and cops.
Kids and cops. And then what comes to local government is usually going into public safety. So that's the reality of where the money and funds are going. And so if you want to do a public safety mill levy, to ask the voters, look, we need to raise your property taxes so much amount of money or so many mills so that we can generate this amount of money to pay for 2 more cops or 5 more cops or whatever it might be. Or we need to build a new high school or we need to do an addition on the high school, whatever. So we're always asking the voters, can we raise your taxes? So that's the other thing is these voted in mill levies can bump that up. And a lot of local government now is turning to that as an option because they're tapped out.
That's where we are.
Yeah. And so everything you're asking is the voters, and they're the ones going to decide one way or the other.
Tax question for you. We're in an unusual situation in Missoula County where we have close to 120,000 residents. And in 2021, close to 2 million people visited us. And when they were here, they drove on our roads. They felt safe because they could call 911 at any time. They interacted with friendly, smart people, products of our public education system at stores, etc., all over town. And sure, they came here because there's an airport and we're halfway between these 2 iconic national parks, but they stayed for a couple days because it's a really nice place. We pay for all the services that those nearly 2 million people provide. Certainly they put money into the economy, but they don't put money into the economy that then goes and pays for those services. Because those services, as you pointed out, come from property taxes. What do you see as a solution to that?
Sales tax. Let's look at West Yellowstone for an example. West Yellowstone, they have a resort tax. There's 1,100 full-time residents that live in West Yellowstone, and they have about 3 to 3.5 million people pass through their community every year, having an impact on their infrastructure.
Incredible.
And there's a value, I think, in property there. There's a value because of those 3 million people. But you have people come through and patron your restaurant, patron your curio shop, or whatever it might be, that does not increase your property value. And so what they're finding is we're stuck having to repair roads, having to deal with sidewalks, having to build a water and sewer system, and we have to pay those water sewer rates to accommodate 3.5 million plus 1,100, right? We've got to pay that. And so that, I think, was where the pressure came for the legislature to say, well, maybe we can create a resort tax that will allow these communities that are being impacted. Now, think of this. This is in the 80s, what things were like and where our state economy was in the 80s. And so this was kind of an anomaly. But yeah, okay, we're recognizing this. We're going to allow this resort tax option for you. So first thing, and I've got a presentation that I give about West Yellowstone because I travel around on occasion and I'm invited to talk about resort tax for different communities.
Yeah.
What would this mean for us? Does it make sense for our community? Would we qualify? And I've got a series of pictures of West Yellowstone. The first thing they did, and I can't remember if it was water or sewer, but when they first got that resort tax, that was the first thing they did. I've got a picture of their well where they captured their spring, where they captured their municipal water, and there's tires and plywood and pallets thrown in this little sinkhole thing. It looked terrible, and they cleaned that all up. So they had money now to deal with this. They cleaned it all up. They put a fence around it, and their water quality went up. They started replacing water lines, and then they went to the sewer system, redid their sewer system, redid their sewer lines. And then they went to streets, redid their streets, then curbs, sidewalks. It seems to me to be trusting when you look at these local governments. Trust them to make the right decision for their community. The first thing they didn't do is build a huge civic center with an indoor swimming pool.
Yeah.
No, they said, we've got to deal with our water, our sewer, our streets. The very core of our purpose of existing as a government is to provide these essential services. Now it's 30 years later. Every time it comes up the ballot, because it has a sunset, they voted in, and each time it's at a higher rate.
The resort tax.
The resort tax has to be voted in, and it's being supported at a higher and higher number. Those folks recognize and appreciate, yes, they're going to be paying a little bit more in a sales tax that they wouldn't if they just go up to Bozeman or over to Ennis. They wouldn't have to pay that. They recognize that there's going to be a little bit of a cost to them, but they're leveraging those dollars, their contribution into their community, with the 3.5 million. Now back to your point, you're too big because you have to have a population of 5,500.
Yeah.
Maybe look at Lolo. Maybe Lolo might.
Yeah, they're looking at it.
So they might qualify for it.
Lolo Community Council is interested.
Yeah, in Bonner or some of these other places, they can look at that and say, could we create a resort tax district? Then again, what does that money go for? It's going to go into likely water, sewer, because there's those things that we can't keep up on ourselves, and we're not getting much support from the state. And so where does this money come from? That's the question. If we're tapped out in our property tax and we're not seeing much of the way our tax structure is set up, that income tax does not come to local government.
Yeah.
And you talk about the amount of money we have at the state level, yes, but that's generated by the rise in our income in the state. So that doesn't have any correlation to property tax. So we're looking at two different things. We're looking at the state's flush, but not because of property tax rise. The state's flush because of income tax rise or increase. And local governments are still struggling, crow hopping along, trying to make it go without this additional revenue.
Do you think there's a compelling argument to be made to the state that the population cap should be lifted from 5,500 to countywide? And it's all voluntary, voters voted in, and using the same Department of Commerce metrics to determine if your county qualifies. What's the argument to be made? Is there a chance the state would go for it?
Yeah, because the population in 1985 is significantly different than it is in 2021.
It's different in the way our economy, how we generate revenue.
So Missoula's an economically different universe than it was in 1985.
Yeah. And so trying to get our head wrapped around that, right? If we're going to create a tax structure, how do we create a tax structure today that looks like today's economy? Which looks completely different than it did 40 years ago, and where it worked. And I think there's some pride that we have that we don't have a sales tax, and we kind of like that. There's that pride. And when we did ask that question in the 80s, went on a statewide ballot, do we want to have a sales tax? It lost by like 75%. There's a stigma out there about it's like the third rail here in Montana to talk about sales tax. But I think I have just anecdotally been seeing
now have an
more-
opportunity to encourage our visitors to participate, provide an opportunity for our visitors to participate.
Is that difference in nuance too thin to actually work for the electorate? The difference between a local sales tax oriented at tourists, not statewide, not in every community, not in every county. That's over here. And over here, sales tax for everyone for everything. Yeah. My concern is that difference is too thin. And when I've tried this out on some other folks, their first response is, well, no sales tax. That wasn't a sales tax. But is it so sales tax adjacent it can't be real? Expanding the resort tax.
Oh, yeah. What I like about taking some of those limits off is let the communities decide.
Yeah.
I think that has been an ethic and a value of Montana since our 1972 Constitution. We have this value of letting the power of government is derived by the people, and the idea that let the people decide what works for them and what they want to do. And that's where I would say the school bond issues. Let the local folks decide rather than the state having control over that. Some of the challenges with the local option tax is that because we are such a rural state and people travel to the economic centers of the state to do their shopping, and so they're contributing to that economy, which is you're also using those resources, right? What it's going to go back to. They may not have tourists. We don't have this opportunity for us to access some of these things, and so we're still stuck. And so there's this equity thing too. That's why I think for years it's really had a challenge.
I think it is really challenging. Given the number of tourists we have here, we could generate so much money that it would actually shrink property taxes, not just arrest the growth, but property taxes would go down. And I could see the math where you would pay more on a Tuesday for your lunch if you went out to lunch. But at the end of the year, you would have paid far less in property taxes, and you would actually be money ahead, even if you went out to lunch once a week. But you would only feel that when you paid your property taxes, which for some people it's every month, and for other people it's twice a year. I get that it's a tough sell. I wonder, is there a way to structure a tourist tax so that locals don't have to pay it? I mean, could you get a rebate on your property tax, or would it be possible, legal or technically possible, to swipe your credit card and if the zip code is from out of the county, you don't pay for it?
That's a good question. I don't know enough about the legalities of it because we have certain clauses where there's equal protections in some of those things. There's also these values and ethics that we have that, as far as government's concerned, we're all treated the same. But that's kind of a legal argument that maybe could be explored to determine whether we could do something like that where there's a difference based on your zip code, whether you're contributing or not. So that aside, it's math. It's just trying to figure out the math of it. It's challenging, it's hard, and it's complicated, but we do challenging, hard things in Montana. That's our thing. And so I think we can solve some of these wicked issues that we're facing if we have the will. We're willing to make the investment of time to understand the complexities and the nuances and the cause and effects, and it's going to take some time, and we need to be patient with that, both as the citizenry and government, as we try to get our head wrapped around how do we fund government in the state of Montana? How do we provide these essential services to all our citizens in a fair and equitable way?
Well, so I just want to make sure that we ask this in a way that you're able to put a bow on it. But so the 2021 legislature was kind of a doozy for Missoula County on many fronts. Gas tax was a major state law change. So can you explain kind of the role the legislature plays on how county governments are impacted?
For most people, again, this is nuancy stuff, and it's just these local government geeks like myself that really thrive in this area. But the purpose of a legislature is to focus statewide. Right. What is this policies and things that we need to think about statewide, and how does it affect it? Which is a challenge for our state because we have such a varied economies around the region. It's challenging, but that's their focus and their role. Their lane is to looking at state level policy and investment. And then we have the local governments, right, that are looking at, well, how do we address these local needs? Counties are a subdivision of state government where you're giving certain powers and authorities to administer state interests on a local level. So when there is a jurisdiction or an area that says we need a water district, or we need a sewer district, we need a fire district, we want fire protection, rather than going and petitioning the state legislature to create this local district, they've empowered counties to administratively create these other jurisdictions. And then they create boards, and you have some legislative authority or some discretion as to what authorities you're going to delegate to them as a district, what authority do you want to retain? If you want to retain all of it, and you become the district board and you manage it, or you can delegate it to someone else. So there's some discretion that the state has given to the local counties to make decisions on what works best for them. But that's really where the counties operate at that next level down from the state. How do we administer the interests of the public for the state's good on the local level? That's why the entire state is covered by a county. Every citizen in the state of Montana falls within a county jurisdiction that has certain authorities that they can exercise on behalf of that constituency. What was your question again? I'm trying to put a bow on this.
I think you've done it. It's just the role.
That relationship. Yeah. And so that's where.
And how county governments are impacted by, the frustration of the gas tax experience, which is where citizens actually voted to tax themselves so that you could improve roads and bridges just in Missoula County. And then that opportunity or power was taken away.
This really would have allowed our guests to help cover some of the costs of some of the services they use.
So there's two things I want to highlight, and this is from our state constitution. Again, geeky nerd like me, I'm always 3 or 4 times a week, I'm delving into the Constitution, into the Montana Code Annotated, almost every day for the code, trying to help local governments and people in the state figure out how does this operate. Two things I want to point out in our Article 2, which is our Declaration of Rights in our Constitution. Sections 1 and 2. So these are when they sat down in 1972 and said, we're going to create a new, basically, Bill of Rights for the state of Montana. What is it that we value? What is really important to us? And I would encourage anyone to go back and read that set of rights that they've enumerated for us in Montana. They're powerful. No other state in the nation has this level of rights that have been enumerated in the state of Montana. It's something for us to be proud of. We have a right to know, a right to participate, a right to privacy. The right to privacy is not even extended to us from our federal constitution. It's something that we have and we cherish in the state of Montana. So, Section 1, popular sovereignty. This is Section 1 of Article 2. It says, all political power is vested in and derived from the people. All government of rights originates with the people, is founded upon their will only, and is instituted solely for the good of the whole. So you think about that value statement. I would love it if we can, as Montanans, get in touch with those values that we're enumerating here. And what does that mean to us? And as a legislature, how do we listen to this empowered people, that they're there to fulfill the will of the people, as you are, as an elected official, that you're asked and invited by the public to facilitate on their behalf the management of these important resources and assets for their benefit and for their good. And there's an accountability baked into that if you don't do a good job, then we'll remove you and put someone else in there. That's why I have an issue with term limits. We already have term limits. Every 4 years or every 2 years, you get a chance to go back to the voters and say, this is what I've done for you, and this is how I voted. And does this reflect your values, your interests, and your needs? The other one, Section 2, it says self-government. But people have the exclusive right of governing themselves as a free, sovereign, and independent state. They may alter or abolish the Constitution and form of government whenever they deem it necessary. So it's also baked into our Constitution and our law that we have this ability to evaluate. Nothing's carved in stone in Montana. The form of government that operates, that we'll probably talk about here in a minute, here in Missoula County or the city of Missoula, can be changed by the will of the people. They can choose some other form or some other power. They can grant or they can take away. And I think that's an important thing that we as Montanans need to understand, that we have this incredible constitution that empowers the citizens to make decisions, and that we're stewards of that decision-making process. And we're to operate our local governments and our state government to reflect the will of the people. Now, if that will changes over time, if these values no longer are reflective of our state, then that's maybe a discussion we need to have. But I think the problem is we're not grounded in this. We're not talking about it.
I think what we found with the gas tax is it's not just the will of the people, but will of which people. So the people of Missoula County voted for this, but the legislature said no.
What's the difference between various forms of government that a county can be?
Yeah, so I'll just briefly touch on, there's 3 things that define who you are. There's the powers that you have as a county government or city. And cities and counties, there's power, the power that you operate with, the form of government, and then the plan of government. So we'll start with power. There's 2 types of powers that you can operate with. One is general governing powers, which means you can only exercise powers that are granted to you by the legislature. So if you don't have an enumerated power in the Constitution where it says you can operate or do something, you can't do it. So it's got to be in the MCA or in the Constitution. Or there's the self-governing powers, which means you can exercise any power that's not prohibited by the law or the Constitution. So that provides you much more flexibility to be nimble and responsive to your needs of your constituency. That if it doesn't specifically say thou shalt not do this or exercise this power, the assumption is that you can exercise that power. So
could the legislature take something away retroactively?
what they'll do is there is a list of powers denied to local governments, and that list, every time the legislature meets lately, has been growing. They've been adding things to that list. So they are limiting the amount of power you can exercise as a self-governing power, which I guess coming back to this idea of popular sovereignty and self-government in the state, there's a bit of a disconnect that I'm seeing, that they're preemptively taking away certain powers that the citizens of the state of Montana may want to exercise. They want to see something happen, but the legislature as a body may say, no, we're not going to let you do that. That's why I'm saying there's this bit of a disconnect, and that's where this grounding back into our values and say it may not be something that I personally like or want to see, but if a majority of the people in this jurisdiction choose to do that, then let that majority of that jurisdiction deal with it. So it's a philosophical discussion as well, but those are the two powers. And then there's the form of government. And the form that you are operating with is what I will call the commission form, where the elected body is both the legislative, where you make policy and ordinances, and also the executive branch rolled into one. All of our forms of government that are available to us in Montana are based on the same three branches of government. We have executive, legislative, and judicial branches. And every form of government is an option. There's 5 different forms that are outlined in the law that you can choose from, one of which is the commission form. There's no correlation between the powers that you operate with. It's just the form of government that you have. And then the plan, there's certain authorities that you may have. Think of it as a buffet. Each form of government has a buffet, and you can choose from that buffet how you want to exercise that particular form of government. For example, you can have 3 commissioners, or you can have 5, or you can have 7 or 9, right? And the voters at the end of the day are the voters are the ones that choose. You put on the ballot, do you want to change? And we want to look like this or look like that. And the voters will decide whether they want to accept that or not. So at the end of the day, if you want to change your power, your form or plan of government to make it more nimble, more responsive, or to reflect the needs that you're facing, you can package that up and present it to the voters and say, this we think would be better than what we're doing now in this way. And the voters can say yes or no. We've had that recently. The city of Havre recently adopted self-governing powers and a charter form of government.
Did it go well?
Yeah, they passed it in November of 2019, went into effect just, I think, a year or so ago.
And how many years did they spend preparing the citizens for that discussion?
It was on the ballot, I think, 2 previous times. But they were also changing their form of government from a commission executive or mayor council form of government to a manager form of government. And they just weren't sure about that shift, but they did like the idea of having self-governing powers in a charter. They just weren't sure about shifting. So each time it was brought before the voters, they said, yeah, and finally they said, okay, we hear you. You like this part, but not that part. So we'll remove that part, do status quo, but we wanted to have additional powers. And they voted it in.
So before we go, give us a nugget of wisdom, something you've come across in a book or a podcast or a movie or boutique TV, anything you stumbled into recently that really grabs you.
I should have prepared for the nugget. I came prepared for the book, not the nugget.
But you can talk a book,
Well,
that's fine.
Yeah, there's a couple books I'm reading right now. One for work is The Leadership Challenge by Kouzes and Posner, which we do a lot of training on that. So I'm always reading that and being fresh on it. And I like that particular book because it talks about leadership is based on your behavior, not based on some sort of charismatic personality, but if you behave in certain ways that have been identified as leadership behaviors, then you'll become more of a leader. And I think that's a very accessible way of looking at leadership. The other book that I'm hacking through is The Immortal Irishman by Tim Egan. And so it's about the first territorial governor of Montana, Marr.
Yeah.
Thomas
Marr. Yeah. I'm in and out of that book, and so I almost have to go back 5 pages to get caught up.
A tough son of a gun, if I remember right.
Yeah. So it's interesting, and so I've been starting that. I'm heading to Ireland this summer for a couple weeks, and I want to get a little bit of that.
Where in Ireland?
Southwest part. So Limerick, Galway, the Aran Islands.
So the Cliffs of Moher.
Cliffs of Moher.
Yeah.
My wife loves that place, and so she just finished her doctorate, and so this is her reward.
Oh, good for her.
Well, I'll say it this way. She's going to Ireland, and she's invited me to come with her.
Fantastic.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Dan, and we definitely got to have you back.
Oh,
This-
anytime. I
It's
enjoy
really a
doing
treat.
this.
Thanks.